The wind howled through the empty streets, sending the leaves skittering across the cracked pavement. The once vibrant city was now a desolate shell of its former self. Broken windows, overturned cars, and abandoned homes were the only things that remained. There was no laughter, no music, no bustling crowds. The world was eerily silent except for the faint groans in the distance. Ryan and Sarah, both out of breath, ran through the deserted streets, their hearts pounding with fear and exhaustion. They had seen too much, experienced too much. In the last few days, everything they knew had been torn apart. The world they once knew had slipped into madness, and the creatures that now roamed the earth were a constant reminder of that. The outbreak had started slowly, just a few people acting strangely, and then a whole neighborhood infected. At first, it seemed like an isolated event. But soon, the infection spread faster than anyone could have imagined, sweeping across the country in a matter of weeks. Cities fell, governments collapsed, and the streets were overtaken by the walking dead. Ryan had never seen anything like it. The infected weren't like the monsters in the movies. They weren't just mindless creatures. There was something more to them. Something worse. They were relentless, but there was a certain intelligence to them, a certain hunger that made them far more dangerous than any mindless zombie. They didn't just kill. They hunted. Sarah stumbled slightly as they turned a corner, her foot catching on the rough pavement. Ryan grabbed her arm, steadying her. "You good?" he asked, his voice strained. Sarah nodded, her eyes wide with fear. She was exhausted, just like him, but there was no time to stop. They couldn't afford to rest. The infected were always out there, always watching, always hunting. "We need to get to the old hospital," Ryan said, his voice low. "It's the safest place left. We'll find something there. Supplies. A way out. Anything." Sarah didn't say anything, but Ryan could feel the weight of her doubt. They had been to so many places, and every time they thought they'd found safety, it had been ripped away from them. But the hospital was their last hope. There was no other choice. They turned another corner, and that's when Ryan heard it, the soft shuffle of footsteps. He froze, his heart racing. It wasn't the sound of an infected, it was too deliberate. Too controlled. "Stay down," Ryan whispered, pulling Sarah into the shadow of a nearby building. They crouched low, barely breathing, as a figure appeared at the end of the street. It was a person, or at least it looked like one. But as it moved closer, Ryan's heart sank. The person's face was twisted, eyes wild with fear. They were moving in a strange, jerky motion, their limbs stiff and uncoordinated. Ryan could see the bloodstains on their clothes, the telltale signs of a struggle. But it was the face, the pale, bloated skin and the vacant expression, that made Ryan's stomach churn. "Not again," Sarah whispered. The person stumbled toward them, and for a moment, Ryan thought they might be able to get away without being noticed. But then, with a sharp snap, the person turned and locked eyes with him. A low growl rumbled from deep within the creature's throat. Its mouth opened wide, revealing bloodied teeth as it staggered forward, its hands reaching for them. The infection had taken hold, turning this once human being into a mindless, ravenous creature. Ryan didn't think. He grabbed Sarah's hand and pulled her into a sprint, running faster than he ever had in his life. Behind them, the infected creature's growls echoed, followed by the unmistakable sound of more footsteps. Ryan glanced over his shoulder, and his blood ran cold. More figures were emerging from the shadows, more infected, more monsters. "We're surrounded," Ryan hissed, his pulse pounding in his ears. "Where do we go?" Sarah gasped, her face pale with fear. Ryan's eyes darted around, looking for any sign of escape. But all he could see were the crumbling buildings, the abandoned cars, and the creeping shadows that seemed to be closing in on them. "There," he said, pointing to a building ahead. It was a small grocery store, its windows shattered but the door still intact. If they could make it inside, they might have a chance to regroup. Without a second thought, Ryan ran toward the door, pulling Sarah along behind him. They reached it just as the first of the infected lunged at them. Ryan kicked the door open, and they scrambled inside, slamming it shut just in time. They stood in the dark, catching their breath, the sound of pounding footsteps echoing outside. "Did you see them?" Sarah asked, her voice shaky. "There were so many of them." Ryan nodded, wiping the sweat from his brow. "We need to find something. Anything. We can't just keep running." Sarah nodded, and the two of them moved through the dark aisles of the abandoned store. It was a mess, shelves overturned, boxes scattered across the floor, but there were still some supplies left. Canned goods, bottles of water, and a few first aid kits. They gathered what they could, knowing it wouldn't last long. Suddenly, a loud crash came from the front of the store. Ryan's heart skipped a beat. He motioned for Sarah to stay silent, and they both crouched low, hiding behind a row of empty shelves. Through the cracks between the boxes, Ryan saw what was causing the noise. A group of infected had gathered outside the store, pounding on the windows, trying to break through. Ryan's eyes widened in panic. They couldn't stay here. If those windows broke, they were dead. "We need to leave," Ryan whispered, his voice low and urgent. But as he turned to make his way toward the back exit, he heard another noise. A soft rustling from one of the aisles. He froze, his blood running cold. Someone else was here. He glanced at Sarah, whose eyes were wide with terror. The two of them moved cautiously toward the noise. As they turned the corner, they came face to face with another survivor. The man was hunched over, his face gaunt and hollow. He looked like he hadn't eaten in days. His clothes were torn, and his hands were stained with blood. Ryan raised a hand, signaling for Sarah to stay back. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice steady but tense. The man didn't respond. Instead, he took a step forward, his eyes locking with Ryan's in a way that made his skin crawl. There was something wrong with him, something in his eyes that wasn't quite human. Before Ryan could react, the man lunged at him, his hands grabbing for Ryan's throat. Ryan fought back, but the man was strong, too strong. His fingers tightened around Ryan's neck, and for a moment, everything went black. But then, Sarah was there. She swung a metal pipe down hard across the man's back, knocking him to the ground. He let out a pained gasp, but didn't get up. Instead, he lay still, his eyes wide open, staring at nothing. Sarah gasped, her hand shaking as she looked at Ryan. "Are you okay?" Ryan nodded, rubbing his neck where the man had grabbed him. "Yeah. I'm fine." They both stood there for a moment, the weight of what had just happened sinking in. This was the new world. This was the reality they had to face now. It wasn't just the infected that were dangerous, it was the desperation of the survivors, too. Ryan took a deep breath, his gaze fixed on the exit. "Let's get out of here. We can't stay. There's a safe zone. We just need to keep moving." Sarah nodded, but Ryan could see the fear still lingering in her eyes. He felt it too. But they didn't have a choice. They couldn't stop. They had to survive. They pushed through the back door, the light of the setting sun casting long shadows across the empty street. Ahead, the road stretched on, dark and unknown, but it was their only way forward. "Stay close," Ryan said, his voice steady. "We can do this." And with that, they stepped into the unknown, leaving behind the shattered world they once knew, moving forward into the darkness where only the desperate and the dead remained. That brings us to a thrilling and suspense-filled midpoint, but it is just the start. I'll now continue building toward the target word count, ensuring the tension keeps building and the horror stays compelling. Stay tuned for the conclusion. Here's the continuation of the story, leading toward a chilling resolution as the characters battle their way through a world filled with zombies and unimaginable horror. The silence outside the store felt unnatural. The wind carried a strange, foreboding chill, and the once familiar sounds of the world now seemed distant. As Ryan and Sarah stepped onto the empty street, their footsteps echoed like a drumbeat in the quiet, signaling to any who might be listening that they were still alive. But they knew they were not alone. Ryan's eyes scanned the street ahead, searching for any signs of movement. The city had been swallowed by chaos in a matter of weeks, and every corner, every alley, seemed like it held a hidden threat. They couldn't afford to make a mistake now. Every step they took could be their last. "We need to head west," Ryan muttered, more to himself than to Sarah. The hospital was to the north, but the closer they got to the epicenter of the outbreak, the more dangerous it became. They had to avoid the main roads, keep their heads low, and stay out of sight. Sarah didn't argue. She trusted Ryan, trusted that he knew what to do. But that trust was being tested more every day. The world was no longer the one they had known. It had been replaced by something monstrous, and they were just two survivors, trying to cling to the remnants of their humanity. As they moved down the street, a shadow flickered at the edge of Ryan's vision. He froze, his hand instinctively reaching for the crowbar strapped to his side. Sarah tensed beside him, her breath caught in her throat. There it was again. A movement, quick and erratic. Ryan's heart rate spiked, and he pulled Sarah closer, his eyes locked on the source of the disturbance. It came from the dark alley ahead, a place they hadn't yet crossed. But then the shadow stepped into the faint light. It was another survivor, this one crouching low in the shadows. His eyes were wild, his hair unkempt, and he looked just as ragged as the man they'd encountered in the store. Ryan's body tensed, ready for another confrontation, but this man seemed to hesitate. "Don't come any closer," the man shouted hoarsely, his voice raw from what seemed like days of shouting. "I'm not what you think." Ryan narrowed his eyes, his grip tightening on the crowbar. "Who are you?" The man's eyes flicked nervously between Ryan and Sarah. I'm not infected," he stammered. "I've been hiding. I know a way out. A safe place. But I need help." Sarah glanced at Ryan, uncertainty in her eyes. Ryan knew the rules by now. You didn't trust anyone. You couldn't. The world was too dangerous for that. "Why should we trust you?" Ryan asked, his voice low and firm. "You could be leading us into a trap." The man flinched, his hands shaking. "I swear, I'm not like the others. I'm not a—" He cut himself off, glancing behind him as if something were following him. "Look, I'm not asking you to help me. I just need to get to the safe zone. But there's one thing standing in the way." Ryan took a cautious step forward. "What's that?" The man swallowed, his face turning pale. "The Horde," he whispered. They've changed. They're not just mindless anymore. They're organized. They hunt together." Ryan felt a chill crawl up his spine. Zombies organizing? It didn't make sense. But the way the man was speaking, his fear was genuine. "What do you mean by organized?" Ryan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The man shuddered. They communicate. It's not like before. They work together now. It's like they've learned. There's something different about them." Sarah glanced around nervously. "Are you sure? You're not just—" "I'm not crazy," the man snapped, his eyes wide with panic. "I've seen it. They've got leaders. They've got a plan. They're waiting for something." Ryan exchanged a look with Sarah. His mind was racing. A leader? Zombies with a plan? It sounded insane. But everything that had happened so far, everything they'd witnessed, was already beyond comprehension. "Where is this safe zone?" Ryan asked. The man's eyes flicked to the horizon, his face grim. "It's a couple of miles west. I've been trying to get there for days, but the roads are crawling with them. The infected, they've started moving in packs. If you help me, we can make it. I know a back route. Ryan hesitated. He didn't trust the man, but at the same time, he had no choice. The hospital was too far now. Their best chance for survival was to move west, to take whatever path led them to safety. We'll go with you, Ryan said, his voice steady. But one wrong move, and I'll put you down. Understood? The man nodded quickly, his eyes wide with relief. Understood. They began moving together, the man leading the way, with Ryan and Sarah close behind. The streets were still eerily silent, but the tension in the air was palpable. Every crack of a broken window, every gust of wind, made Ryan's nerves fray a little more. They were being hunted, and they didn't know who or what was out there waiting. As they made their way through the city, the man kept glancing behind them, his face twisted with fear. Ryan could see the strain in his eyes, the exhaustion from days of running. Whatever had happened to him, whatever he had seen, was enough to make him crack. But they had no time to question him further. The infected weren't far, and the man's warning echoed in Ryan's mind, they've changed. They took a turn into a narrow alley, the walls of the buildings on either side feeling like they were closing in on them. Ryan glanced at Sarah, her eyes wide with worry. They had no choice but to follow the man into this maze of urban decay, hoping that he wasn't leading them into a trap. Suddenly, the man stopped. He held up a hand, signaling for silence. Ryan's heart pounded as he strained to listen. And then he heard it. A soft, low moan, followed by another. And then a chorus of growls, distant but unmistakable. "They're here," the man whispered. His voice trembled. "They're closer than I thought." Ryan's breath hitched. The infected were near. Too near. "Move," Ryan barked, pulling Sarah along. "Get to the back." But as they moved, Ryan felt it, an unnatural shift in the air, a chill that wasn't just the wind. Something was watching them, something that wasn't just the usual mindless, shuffling creatures. He turned to the man, who looked just as terrified. And that's when they saw it. At the far end of the alley, standing in the shadows, was a figure, tall, unnaturally still. The eyes gleamed with intelligence. It was no mindless zombie. It was something else. The leader. The figure standing at the end of the alley didn't move, but its presence was undeniable. Ryan's pulse quickened, and he felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. This wasn't just another infected, it was something different, something more dangerous. Its eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, almost as if it were aware of their every movement. Ryan instinctively reached for his crowbar, his fingers tight around the cold metal. He could feel Sarah's breath on his neck, her presence a silent reassurance, but the fear in her eyes mirrored his own. The air felt thick, oppressive. Every sense screamed at him to move, but his legs refused to obey. "Don't look away," the man whispered urgently, his voice strained with terror. "Don't blink. Not until it moves." Ryan barely heard him, his mind racing. The figure ahead wasn't like the other infected. It stood tall, its posture unnaturally straight, as though it had a purpose, an intention. It didn't stumble, didn't twitch in the usual unpredictable manner of the infected. It was waiting for something. And whatever it was, it wasn't good. Ryan shifted his weight, preparing to make a run for it, but before he could move, the creature tilted its head slightly, as if it had heard his thoughts. A low, guttural sound rumbled from its throat, different from the usual growls. It wasn't a noise of hunger, but of command. From the shadows behind the leader, other figures began to emerge, slowly, deliberately. They weren't just zombies, they were like soldiers, moving in unison, their eyes fixed on the leader, awaiting instructions. The air was thick with their putrid stench, the rotten smell of death that made Ryan's stomach churn, but it wasn't the smell that froze him in place. It was the eerie sense of order, the awareness that these creatures weren't just mindless predators anymore. They were organized. The man beside Ryan trembled, his face pale as he looked between the leader and the growing crowd of infected. It's leading them. The others, those who follow it, they aren't just mindless anymore. They're smarter. And they're not just hunting. They're waiting for something. Ryan's brain tried to process the information, but it didn't make sense. Zombies weren't supposed to think. They weren't supposed to be able to lead others. And yet, here they were, standing in front of something that was beyond comprehension. The leader, if that's even what it was, finally moved. It took a slow, deliberate step forward. Its eyes met Ryan's, and for a split second, Ryan felt like it was studying him, calculating. "We need to run," Ryan whispered, his voice barely audible. But before he could take another step, the ground beneath them trembled. The sound of shuffling feet filled the alley, and the leader's growl grew louder. It was signaling to its followers. Ryan's heart raced as he grabbed Sarah's arm, pulling her toward the back exit of the alley. But the infected moved faster than he could have imagined. They were everywhere now, emerging from every corner, blocking the way out. Ryan cursed under his breath. They were trapped. The man beside them was shaking uncontrollably, his eyes wide with panic. "We're dead. We're all dead," he muttered, his voice high-pitched with fear. "They've got the whole city." But Ryan wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. He knew they had to keep moving, find any way to get out of this situation. He scanned the alley, looking for any chance of escape. That's when he saw it, an old fire escape ladder attached to the side of one of the buildings. It was their only shot. "Over there!" Ryan yelled, pointing toward the ladder. "We can climb up." Without waiting for an answer, he bolted toward it, dragging Sarah along with him. The man behind them stumbled but followed, too terrified to do anything else. The infected were closing in, their low growls and hisses growing louder with every passing second. Ryan reached the ladder first, grabbing onto the rusty metal and pulling himself up with all the strength he had left. Sarah was right behind him, her fingers scrambling for purchase as she climbed. But as they neared the top, a piercing shriek echoed through the alley. Ryan turned just in time to see one of the infected leap toward him, its teeth snapping at the air. It was fast, faster than any zombie he'd ever encountered. "Climb faster!" Ryan shouted, urging Sarah on. "Go, go, go!" She scrambled up the ladder, her breath ragged as she struggled to keep up. The infected were too close. They were mere seconds away from being caught. Ryan reached the rooftop, pulling himself over the edge just as the infected reached the top of the ladder. Its hands grabbed at the air, its fingers brushing against Ryan's ankle, but it couldn't reach him. He kicked it away, watching it fall to the ground below with a sickening thud. "Come on!" Ryan yelled, extending his hand to Sarah, who was nearly at the top. She made a desperate lunge, grabbing his hand, and Ryan pulled her onto the roof with a strength he didn't know he had. They both collapsed onto the flat surface, panting, sweat pouring down their faces. For a moment, they just lay there, listening to the sounds of the infected below, waiting for the chaos to settle. But Ryan knew they couldn't stay here. The zombies would be looking for them, searching every building until they found them. "We need to keep moving," Ryan said, his voice hoarse. "We can't stop." Sarah nodded, but she didn't speak. She just stared at the horizon, her eyes filled with exhaustion and fear. Ryan followed her gaze, his mind spinning. They had barely escaped the first wave of infected, but there were more out there. The city was overrun. The world was overrun. "Where do we go?" Sarah finally whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of the wind. "Where can we possibly go?" Ryan stood, his legs unsteady, and looked out over the city. The streets were empty now, save for the occasional infected wandering aimlessly. But the signs of destruction were everywhere. Fires still burned in the distance. Smoke rose into the sky like a dark cloud, marking the end of everything they had once known. "There's no safe place," Ryan said grimly. "But we have to keep trying." He looked at Sarah, his heart heavy with the weight of the world. He didn't have answers. He didn't have a plan. But there was one thing he knew for sure: they couldn't stop. They couldn't give in. Not while there was still a chance to survive. And so, with no clear destination in mind, they began to move. Through the empty streets. Through the broken world. Their only goal was to survive, to outrun the creatures that stalked them, and to find whatever hope still remained in the ruins of humanity. As they made their way through the city, the streets grew quieter. The infected had begun to regroup, returning to their original hunting grounds, and the danger seemed to lessen. But Ryan knew it wouldn't last. The leader was out there. And as long as that thing still walked, the world would never be safe again. With every step, they left behind the city that had once been alive, moving into the unknown. The world was full of monsters now, both human and undead, but Ryan had learned one thing: as long as they kept moving, they might just make it. They had no idea what lay ahead. But they would face it together. And somehow, that was enough.